Hi, everyone. So today we are starting Unit 3, spanning a continent. We have discovered our continent. We have set up a governance for our continent. Now we're looking at fulfilling the whole continent. Later, we will learn about a thing called manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans had the right to be able to control all of North America from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So we're picking up today in chapter 9, looking at the growth of a nation. We'll be looking at westward expansion. We'll be looking at the War of 1812, the era of good feelings, leading right up to Jacksonian America, the America under President Andrew Jackson. So this chapter is kind of long. There's 5 sections in it. So you're going to do 2 sections today, 9.1 and 9.2. On Monday, you'll do 9.3 and 9.4. And then Tuesday, before you review, you'll finish out 9.5. It's a longer chapter, plus you had your vocabulary quiz yesterday. There we go. All right, so with the election of 1800, the Democrat Republicans came into power. They were also called the Republicans. Now, these are not the Republicans like you think about today. The Republicans at this time were more like the Democrats today. Thomas Jefferson was kind of the leader of these Democrat Republicans, and he took the oath of office on March the 4th, 1801 to become president. He was the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., which was the nation's new but still unfinished capital. So we remember that this capital came out of an agreement with the South that the capital would be in the South. It came out of parts of Maryland, and it's its own little place there. Jefferson spent a good bit of the first part of his presidency reversing some of the things that the Federalists had done. First off was he asked Congress to repeal the Judiciary Act of 1801, and it did. If you remember, the Judiciary Act of 1801 had appointed, basically what came out of it, the midnight judges. These were the judges that John Adams had appointed up to the midnight hours right before he was to leave office. And so with this Judiciary Act of 1801 being repealed, many of those midnight judges never served. The House also impeached John Pickering, a district court judge from New Hampshire, because Pickering was both an alcoholic and insane. 2/3 of the Senate voted to remove him from office. After that, Jefferson's target became Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. But the Congress soon realized that what Jefferson was doing was basically like a witch hunt. He was basically trying to remove any Federalists from their office. And he realized that they continue to allow him to do this, that he would overstep his bounds and become too powerful in the executive office. This was part of that whole checks and balances that the country was set up for. Now, Pickering, he deserved to be removed from office. He was an alcoholic. He was not mentally capable. Samuel Chase, though, while he may have said a few things too much about politics and got too involved in the political process, he did not do anything criminal that would warrant him being removed from office. So Jefferson failed to have Chase removed. Some of the Federalist policies, though, Jefferson had to admit that they were okay. So he realized the wisdom in leaving some of those policies. He had originally opposed the founding of the National Bank, but he left it intact because it was working well. It's one of those things like, I didn't agree with it to begin with, but I have to admit it's working, so we'll just leave it alone. He kept the Federalist plan for repaying war debts. So Jefferson had often complained about the president's use of what's called executive power. It's the growth of the federal government based off of what the actions of the president. And he often had problems with George Washington and John Adams for this, but he soon realized that sometimes that was the best thing, was to be able to use those executive powers. He learned that power is not necessarily bad if used for good ends. Since he believed he was doing right, Jefferson became skillful in using presidential powers. He soon extended his reach further than any of his predecessors had. So while he had complained about Washington and Adams using these presidential powers, he turned around and did the same thing himself. All right, so looking at the Barbary pirates, off the coast of North Africa along the Mediterranean Sea, there was a bunch of small Muslim countries, and they were called the Barbary states. And these Barbary states demanded tribute or a fee from any ships that wanted to sail into the Mediterranean Sea, because they had a key position there right as you go into the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic. So they threatened force against any ship that did not pay these fees. And up till this point in 1801, the United States had just paid the fee. It ended up just being cheaper than it was to cause a war. Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, he had actually proposed an international blockade, which means a blockade against these ships, stopping these ships from being able to trade or do anything, to be able to try to stop these tribute fees. But they learned that it was just easier just to pay, a lot cheaper in the long run to just pay these fees than it was to cause war in the world. But in 1801, the Barbary states got greedy and they increased their tribute fees. And when they did that, Jefferson refused to pay them. The ruler of Tripoli then declared war, and Jefferson sent Commodore Richard Dale and later Commodore Stephen Decatur to the region to protect American interests and deal with the terrorists. Dale tried a local blockade, and then in February 1804, Decatur boldly sailed into Tripoli's harbor and seized the American ship Philadelphia, which had been run aground and captured. Rather than let Tripoli have the ship, he burned it. Over the next decade, Decatur led other missions in the area. In 1805, a combined British and American force moved in on the pirates and settled the tribute dispute. So you may have heard the song, one of the songs for the branches of government, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. What branch of government is that, John? Asking my little John, he's here with me. Do you remember?
Which one?
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
Marines.
This is the Marines, yeah. So this is kind of where that song came from. So the Tripolitan War increased the respect that foreign countries had for the United States. All right, moving on to section 2 here. We're looking at expansion westward, moving across the country. And the first way that they do that, in a big way that gives Americans a huge chunk of the continent, is the Louisiana Purchase. At this point, America pretty much lay east of the Mississippi River. The land west of that belonged to France. Majority of it belonged to France. There was some there that still belonged to Spain, but majority of it belonged to France. And part of this territory that still belonged to France was the port of New Orleans, and it was vital to Americans west of the Appalachians. All trade came down the Mississippi River and was stored there at the port of New Orleans before being sent out to go across the Atlantic to Europe. Nearly, like I said, nearly half of American trade passed through this port, and Spanish-owned Louisiana. So Louisiana at the time is actually owned by Spain. In 1800, Spain gave Louisiana back to France. And then in 1801, Jefferson told Robert Livingston, the American ambassador to France, to try to buy New Orleans and both East and West Florida from France. He began preparing for war with France because if they continue to keep their, excuse me, let me back up. Whoop, rewind. All right. So France was no longer the ally that had helped win American independence. In the years since its revolution, France had rejected Republican ideals. Napoleon Bonaparte now ruled the country. Jefferson suspected that Napoleon, who'd been forced into a temporary truce with Britain, was planning to extend his empire to the Americas. Napoleon's brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, and many troops were already in Haiti. Haiti was an easy launching point for an invasion of North America. Another French force was in a Dutch port awaiting the signal to cross the Atlantic. So that is when, in 1801, Jefferson asked Livingston to go to France and try to buy New Orleans in East and West Florida. And while he sent Livingston, he still began to prepare for war by setting up recruiting centers and sending troops and arms to Mississippi, where he thought that the French might attack them first. So the French foreign minister originally rejected America's offer, but soon a series of events happened that made it beneficial to France. The first thing is a yellow fever epidemic in Haiti, double Napoleon's war losses. Second, winter ice threatened his other army in Holland. So between those two things, he began to realize that he needed to defeat Britain before attacking America. And if Britain were soundly defeated, he could control the seas and then handle a divided America. And the sale of Louisiana would provide the money that Bonaparte needed to fight Britain. So in 1803, 9 months after the Americans' first offer, Talleyrand asked Livingston whether he wanted to buy the entire Louisiana territory. So they agreed on a price of $15 million. Americans later discovered that the territory contained nearly 530 million acres. So the cost was only 2.8 cents per acre. So Livingston wrote to Jefferson, told him of the offer. And Jefferson, he had mixed feelings about the Louisiana purchase. You had all of these people who were already in this territory that were of French and Spanish descent. Could you just automatically make these people Americans? Did the U.S. even have the right to make them citizens just because they purchased? Did the U.S. even have the right to purchase land? Did the Constitution give that right? Now, Jefferson had always had a problem with the presidents using powers that were not specifically put into the Constitution. And he realized that at this point, he could either, one, ask Congress to make an amendment to the Constitution giving that right, which takes several weeks to be able to do, all while Napoleon was getting pretty antsy and he may withdraw his offer, or he could just go ahead and take the offer. And so Jefferson decided to take his offer. He called Congress into a special session to ask for the purchase. He would not bring up any of the constitutional questions concerning the bargain. The Senate approved the purchase and rushed the money to France on the fastest ship available. On December 20th, 1803, Americans raised the Stars and Stripes over the Louisiana territory. So this is the Louisiana territory. If we look here, this in the pink is all the Louisiana territory. So that's a huge amount. It doubled, at least doubled what was already there, already parts of the United States. So then, now that we have this territory, Americans have to look at it. They have to go and explore it, see what's there. So Jefferson asked his secretary, William Lewis, to lead an expedition to explore the West, including the Mississippi River. Lewis, in turn, chose William Clark to help him. He fought with him in the Indian Wars in the Northwest Territory, so we asked him to go with him to help him on this expedition. So this is where we get the Lewis and Clark expedition. A party of 29 men, including guides and soldiers, left St. Louis on May 14th, 1804, 5 months after the U.S. bought the Louisiana Territory. They took keelboats up the Missouri River, until it became shallow, and then they had to abandon the boats and they had to walk or ride. At Fort Mandan in what is now North Dakota, a French fur trapper named Charbonneau joined the expedition. His wife, Sacagawea, also came along. She was a Shoshone Indian woman who had been stolen from her tribe as a child. When the explorers had no transportation and desperately needed horses, they met a group of Shoshone Indians, including Sacagawea's brother, who was now a chief. The Shoshone gave the group 30 horses. So Sacagawea guided the expedition through the Bitterroot Mountains and served as its interpreter. The expedition usually moved about 10 miles a day. It was a beautiful part of the country. If you've ever been out to this part, drove through, it's a beautiful part of the country, but it was also dangerous. There was lots of things there that they had never seen before. Clark nearly lost his life when he encountered a bear that was almost 10 feet or that was more than 7 feet tall. The men shot the bear 10 times before bringing it down. Clark named it the grizzly bear. Later, someone mistook Lewis for an elk and shot him in the leg. He continued on the journey with difficulty. The party split up to explore the branches of the Missouri River on the return trip. They completed the trip back to St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806. They cover more than 9,000 miles in 28 months. So Lewis and Clark became celebrities because of the things that they had done. They published journals, and people began to have this desire to also go out west. They wanted to be able to explore. Zebulon Pike led another expedition authorized by Thomas Jefferson. On his first trip, Pike followed the Mississippi River in search of its source. He let the British know that the American flag would fly over the Louisiana Territory. During his second trip, he took 2 different expeditions, and during his second trip in 1806, 1807, Pike went up the Arkansas River into Spanish-held territories. And it was there that he found the peak that today bears his name, Pike's Peak. All right, so now that's the end of our 2 sections for today. So tomorrow you're going to do 9.3 and 9.4, or excuse me, not tomorrow, Monday, you're going to do 9.3 and 9.4. So you can pause the video here. All right, so picking back up with 9.3 and 9.4 today, you did 9.1 and 9.2 on Friday. So we're looking at the troubles for the growing nation. So of course, as America is expanding, they're going to have problems. It's not going to be happy-go-lucky all the time. We're not quite to their good feelings yet. Everything's not so good. So we're having some troubles here. So we're going to look at what some of those troubles are. And these troubles all lead up to the War of 1812. One problem that they had was their neutral rights at sea. So France and Britain were again at war, but America wanted to be neutral. They didn't want to get involved on any one side. They didn't want to pick a side. They didn't want to fight. They just wanted to remain neutral. So they tried to continue to trade with both France and Britain. So Britain and France, in response to this, both issued laws or brought up old laws. Britain's Orders in Council in 1807 made it illegal for neutral nations to trade in European ports unless they first stopped at a British port for inspection. And then when they stopped at those British ports, they would either buy everything there or would let them go on. France's Berlin and Milan decrees stated that the neutral ships trading with Britain or obeying Britain's Orders in Council could be seized. So it was one of those things like, what you going to do? If you stop at these ports, then France is going to seize your ships. If you trade with Britain, France is going to seize the ships. If you don't stop in the ports, then Britain's. So what you going to do? It's a kind of a bad situation for the U.S. And they were just trying to just go on business as normal. But the potential for the profits from these trading were so high that the Americans decided it was worth the risk just to defy both Britain and France and just continue on like they were. Both Britain and France seized American ships and their cargoes. The British also seized more than 10,000 American sailors, as they had in the 1790s. This practice was called impressment. Although the British released 40% of the sailors once they arrived in England, Americans resented impressment. The British believed that the Americans were telling British sailors to desert. A few British sailors did enlist in the U.S. Navy. The British learned that one deserter, Jenkins Radford, was serving on the USS Chesapeake. When the Chesapeake left harbor on June 1st, 1807, the British were watching for it. The British Leopard ordered the frigate to stop and then fired on it when the American captain refused. 3 Americans were killed and 18 were wounded. The British forcefully removed Radford and 3 other deserters. The Chesapeake affair stirred a desire for war, but Jefferson took a more moderate course. Since he had just disarmed the Navy and the Army to reduce his budget, he really had few options. So as a Democrat Republican, one of their things is not to have a strong standing Army or Navy during peacetime in order to save money. So Jefferson had largely scaled back at this point on their Army and their Navy. So he really was not in a good place to go to war. He chose an economic ploy instead. He believed that the U.S. should close its ports to all trade. He thought the action would make Britain and France beg for American goods. But you have to realize that at this point, America had not been around that long. And yes, they had things that the world wanted to offer, but they could get those goods in other places too. But America didn't have as much as the rest of the world. So they relied on those imports. And if Jefferson closed off trade to all of the world, then it's going to hurt Americans more than it's going to hurt the world. But he still did that with the Embargo Act of 1807, and it ended all exports from the United States. Congress agreed and also forbade American ships to import goods from Europe. So again, the embargo hurt America more than it hurt Britain. Because Jefferson's economic move had not worked well, American leaders began to realize that America's rights were best defended by a strong Navy. All right, so Jefferson had his 2 years in office and declined a 3rd term. His Secretary of State, James Madison, ran for the Democrat Republicans in 1808. He defeated Federalist Charles C. Pinckney. Madison was not a very good president. He served for 2 terms, but his terms were difficult and frustrating. He was indecisive in both war and peace, and when he finally did act, he often did the wrong thing. The Madison administration offered to reopen trade with Britain and France if those countries would stop attacking American ships. Napoleon lifted the Berlin and Milan decrees, but the same day that he repealed the decrees, he signed a new order calling for the confiscation of American ships in French ports. Nevertheless, America resumed trade with the French. England became upset over it. Now some of the problems that they're having, that this new country America is having, is with the Indians. In 1810, frequent Indian attacks occurred in the western Indiana Territory. Settlers blamed the English and the Canadians for inciting the raids. But part of the problem was the unfair treaties that took away Indian land. The first Indian leader to rise against white settlers was the Shawnee chief named Tecumseh. He organized tribes into the north and south into a Indian confederation. He wanted to stop the westward expansion of the whites. Him and his brother, who is known as the Prophet, established a settlement called Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River in the Indiana Territory. In late 1811, General William Henry Harrison marched on Prophetstown. He burned the village and became the hero of Tippecanoe. Later, when he would run for president, his slogan, he became known as Tippecanoe. His slogan for him and his vice president was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. We'll learn about that later. All right, now in section 4, we're looking at the War of 1812. This is a time when, right before this, tensions between Britain and the U.S. continued to mount. The Battle of Tippecanoe had somewhat eased the fears of the Westerners, but they did not believe that they could really be safe until the British were out of Canada. And when the Westerners could not sell a surplus of grain because of poor trade situation, they blamed the British. And in Congress, there was a group of 40 Western and Southern representatives that formed a group under the leadership of Kentucky's Henry Clay. They were called the War Hawks. They elected Clay as Speaker of the House and placed their supporters on important congressional committees. These were the ones that they pushed for war. They wanted a war with Britain. They're the ones, if you think about it, if you see two people fighting, they're the ones that are to the side saying, hit him, hit him, hit him, kind of thing. They were the ones that really wanted the U.S. to go to war. In April 1812, James Madison asked the British to suspend their orders in council. They eventually did on June the 16th, but it was too late at that time. There was no quick means of being able to communicate this across the Atlantic, so word did reach the U.S. before it declared war just 2 days later on June the 18th. But they still continued to go to war, and it lasted for 2.5 years and became known as the War of 1812. So looking at America going into the war, they were unprepared for war. As we talked about, Jefferson had scaled back the Army and Navy, so they didn't have a strong Army and Navy. And Madison hadn't done anything at this point to make that any better. So the Army only had 600 to 700 men, and most of those were in Western forts. So Congress allowed an increase in the Army and called out a militia of 100,000, and these would be 100,000 untrained men. They were not battle trained. Some states, though, refused to commit their troops. They didn't agree with the war, so they didn't think they needed to send their troops. The Navy at the time only had 16 ships. Britain, on the other hand, had 200 frigates, and most of those ships had twice the number amount of guns that the American ships had. Financing was a problem. Congress didn't have a bank to borrow from or to transfer funds from for war supplies. Reduced trade had cut tariff income, and the public, divided over the war, refused to buy war bonds to support it. Another thing was the American generals hurt the war effort. Most of the generals were older men who had not fought actively since the War for Independence. As a result, the first year of fighting in the War of 1812 was a disaster. So we're looking at the War of 1812, looking in 1812 and the war in the North. America's original plan was to attack Canada. They were hoping that since some of the Canadians were French and they didn't really care for British rule, they believed that the Canadians might help them fight the British. But as we've already mentioned, 1812 didn't go well for the American forces. During that first year of the war, America was only able to succeed out at sea. The American frigate Constitution defeated the Guerriere, and the United States victoriously battled the Macedonian. Now, the USS Constitution is still around today. It is the oldest commissioned ship in the American Navy. It's also called Old Ironsides because the men said that the shells, the bombs from the other ships seemed to bounce off her oak sides. So despite everything that was going on during the war at the time, Madison won re-election simply because the people didn't want to change leaders in the middle of the war. So this is a picture of the USS Constitution. You can actually go today and see this ship. You can board the ship. You can look at it. She still has a captain on board, a leader. She still has a crew, and they're all a part of the U.S. Navy. All right, in the Great Lakes region in 1813, after Harrison lost more land battles in the North, the Americans realized that the British were winning because they controlled the Great Lakes. They were able to move troops and supplies easily through the Great Lakes. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry spent almost a year preparing to win control of Lake Erie. He built a naval base on Erie's south shore. He encouraged local militias and entrusted them with the duty of keeping local outposts and shipyards out of British hands. And he built 2 new ships, the Lawrence and the Niagara, for use on the Great Lakes. In September 1813, Perry's new ships met the British in battle. The Lawrence, Perry's flagship, meaning the ship that he was actually on, was heavily damaged early in the attack. Perry boarded the Niagara and refused to surrender. An hour later, the tables turned. Perry wrote General Harrison saying, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." As a result of the battle, the British abandoned Fort Detroit in the Northwest, but they decided to launch a 3-pronged attack on the Northeast, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Mississippi Valley. In the East in 1814, after the British defeated the French in Europe, the British were free to fight much harder in America. In the first prong of the attack, they massed troops at Montreal and moved south using Lake Champlain as a gateway. They wanted to move down the Hudson River, take New York City, and cut off New England. But they were defeated in Plattsburgh, New York. In the second prong of the attack, the British shoved their way into Chesapeake Bay, a haven for American privateers. And they easily pushed back an inexperienced militia at Bladensburg, Maryland on August the 24th, 1814. This victory left the capital open to attack. Congress and President Madison fled across the Potomac to Virginia. The same evening, the British marched into Washington. Admiral General Cockburn and his army went up the Capitol Hill to the House chamber. He stood in the speaker's chair, rapped the gavel for order, and asked his men whether the Capitol should be burned. "Aye, aye," they cheered. Heaping furniture, files, and books from the Library of Congress into the middle of the floor, they set the building afire. He then made his way to the president's house. He bowed in front of the mirror in the drawing room. He took a pillow and one of Madison's hats as souvenirs. His soldiers plundered the valuables, piled up furniture, and torched the building. They burned all of the government buildings except the patent office. A heavy downpour later that night put out the flames and prevented heavier damage to the buildings. The Capitol and the president's house could be rebuilt because the outside walls were in good condition. But the sandstone on the president's house was so darkened by smoke that the house was repainted white. Over the years, the people started to call it the White House. The nation next launched a joint land-sea attack on Baltimore, Maryland, the nation's third largest city. The British Navy opened its guns on Fort McHenry, the harbor's fortresses. But Fort McHenry stood, and the British soon retreated. Almost everyone knows the story of Francis Scott Key, but few know the story of the flag that was still there over Fort McHenry. Flag was made by a widow named Mary Young Pickersgill. She had sewn it in 1813 when Fort McHenry was being renovated. The flag was gigantic. Pickersgill used 400 yards of cloth to make the 30 by 42-foot flag. Each of the flag's 15 stars were 26 inches across. The flag's 15 stripes were all 2 feet wide. The flag was visible from several miles away on a clear day. Major George Armistead, the man in charge of Fort McHenry, clipped part of the flag to give away after the thrilling victory at the fort. Today, the original flag is protected from temperature and humidity by special controls. Just a nice little tidbit there to add into it. All right, so then the British launched a joint land-sea attack. Oh, nope, let's back up. All right, the third prong of the British attack came at New Orleans in January 1815. Major General Andrew Jackson from Tennessee rushed south to save the city. The British attacked the city twice, but Jackson's men threw them back both times. The Battle of New Orleans was the biggest American victory of the war. Had the Americans lost, the British might have tried to take the Louisiana Territory. Although neither force knew it at the time, the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the War of 1812 had officially ended. All right, so the Treaty of Ghent ended the war in February 1814. Americans learned that the treaty of Ghent had been signed on December 24th, ending the war. The treaty failed to settle the key issue over which the war was actually fought, neutral rights at sea, but it did provide for special commissions or groups of officials to settle disputes in later years instead of going to war. Looking at some of the results of the war, the U.S. gained respect in the eyes of other nations. People realized that the United States wasn't going anywhere, that they were a force to be reckoned with. Second, the war inspired a greater sense of nationalism in America. Third, new heroes emerged from the fields of battle, such as Andrew Jackson. The people developed their own industries during the war. They couldn't depend on trade from Europe anymore. They had to come up with their own industries. Napoleon's defeat in Europe and Britain's defeat in North America ended the long struggle between France and Britain, who were colonies in North America, and for supremacy in Europe. So from this point on, Britain and France no longer tried to have colonies in North America. 6, the War of 1812 affected both of the American political parties. The Federalist Party completely went away after this because they opposed the war. All right, and the last section, that's the end of section 4. So section 5, you will do tomorrow, right before you review for your test on Friday. So make sure, or excuse me, not Friday, Wednesday. So make sure that you are still reviewing, using quizzes, and go ahead and reviewing now. All right, so you can stop the video here and pick up tomorrow. All right, guys, so today we're going to look at 9.5. We're looking at the era of good feelings. This was the presidency under James Monroe. It was a time of just good thoughts in America. There was lots of harmony in the country. The title Era of Good Feelings actually came from a Boston newspaper. Okay. So Monroe's election came at a unique time in American politics. The major political parties did not clash on the national level during the era of good feelings that they had in previous decades. In fact, voter turnouts were small because politics had fallen into a predictable pattern. The process of selecting candidates was largely carried out by party caucus a closed meeting of party leaders. Before Monroe's presidency, the parties usually nominated the incumbent or current office holder to run for re-election. Monroe chose John Quincy Adams, son of former President John Adams, to be his Secretary of State, and South Carolina's John C. Calhoun to be his Secretary of War. Monroe did not neglect affairs at home during his administration, but his greatest work resulted from championing American interests abroad. With the war over, the U.S. faced different challenges. The first challenge for Monroe was Florida. In 1810, Americans in West Florida had revolted against Spanish rule. In 1819, the U.S. made a treaty with Spain, purchasing East Florida for $5 million. The U.S. kept ownership of the lands it had already taken in West Florida. The Adams-Onis Treaty defined the Spanish boundary west of the Mississippi. Spain's inability to control its Latin American colonies caused it to lose them as well. Mexico tried to overthrow Spanish rule as early as 1810. And with all this going on, President Monroe came up with what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, and it basically told Europeans, don't get involved in the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. would stay out of European affairs. So you don't mess with us, we won't mess with you, kind of thing. And this was the doctrine that basically the U.S. went on up through World War II. You stay out of us, we stay out of you, kind of thing. It stopped the immediate threat of European intrusion in the Americas. Looking at the economy during the era of good feeling. Although the U.S. avoided major foreign problems during the era of good feelings, it could not avoid some problems at home. The War of 1812 created greater demands for raw materials, causing an economic boom. Because farmers earned higher prices for their crops, more people went west and bought farmland. At the same time, Europe was again producing its own agricultural products. Soon, because so many farms were producing crops, there was a surplus of crops in America. The prices of farm products began to drop. This is something that happens all the time in any kind of industry. And me seeing this firsthand in the farming, I would kind of relate it to that. We see it all the time. People, like, we'll take cotton, for instance. Cotton, a couple of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, went to an extremely high price. It was over $1 a bale. No, dollar a pound, excuse me, $1 a pound. So everybody all of a sudden started growing cotton. Well, then they had so much cotton, there was a surplus of cotton, there was an excess cotton. So the price of cotton dropped down to like 20 cents a pound. So then people got out of growing cotton because it was too cheap to be able to grow. Well, now cotton is once again up above $1 a bale, $1 a pound, excuse me, and people are starting to grow it again. And this is a cycle that happens all the time. People see something being priced real high, so they go after it, and then it just causes the price to go back down because everybody's growing the same thing. Although the National Bank's charter had lapsed briefly, Congress reissued the charter in 1816. Meanwhile, the number of state banks had grown. They were issuing their own banknotes even when they lacked silver and gold to back the notes. When the new national bank called in loans from Western banks, the state banks could not repay them. The economy collapsed. The collapse was especially hard on Southern and Western farmers. They called this crisis the Panic of 1819. It created a distrust of banks and suspicion of rapid economic growth. At the Supreme Court, the states tended to dislike national banks, and some states began to tax the branches of the national banks, hoping that the increased costs would discourage people from using them. When Maryland required the Baltimore branch to issue banknotes on paper bought from the state, the bank refused. Maryland then sued the federal cashier, James McCulloch. The case later reached the Supreme Court. In the McCulloch v. Maryland, the court ruled that a state cannot tax the federal government because the power to tax involves the power to destroy. Chief Justice John Marshall also reaffirmed the legitimacy of the National Bank, basing this decision on the necessary and proper clause. The court also ruled in Gibbons v. Ogden that a state cannot forbid ships to operate in state waters if the ships are licensed by the national government. The case upheld Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, the sale and transport of goods and services from one state to another. The Supreme Court supported economic growth by preventing states from creating transportation monopolies. Although slavery had always been a moral issue, it now produced an economic and political conflict. As the nation expanded westward, Congress debated the future of slavery in the new lands. Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed a Missouri Compromise. It would admit both Maine and Missouri to the Union, and it would keep the balance of slave and free states. Missouri would be a slave state, Maine would be a free state. The compromise would forbid slavery north of the 3630 north latitude, Missouri's southern boundary. It would permit slavery, but not necessarily protect it south of that line. All right, and that is the end of our Chapter 9 notes. So tomorrow, right after this, you're going to review for your test tomorrow. So do well. Y'all have a good rest of your day, and I'll see y'all later.